Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Ian Brown, who is a retired Marine Corps CH-53 Echo Super Stallion helicopter pilot with multiple deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Pacific region. He has written dozens of articles, reviews, and short stories for a variety of defense-related publications covering topics of military history, military theory, future war, and wargaming. His book, A New Conception of War, John Boyd and the U.S. Marines and Maneuver Warfare, was added to the Commandant of the Marine Corps' professional reading program in 2019, and I believe remains on the Commandant's reading list even today. He currently works as a war game analyst for Group W and has designed several war games independently. Ian Brown, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thank you. Happy to be here. And as we said before we started recording, it's good to see you on the other side of the camera again. It's been a couple of years, but it's good that we've stayed connected to be able to do stuff like this. So look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. So today I just want to have kind of a general free roaming conversation about John Boyd and his work, why it matters today, maybe things like, what do people get wrong about Boyd? What is Boyd's background? Why is he still relevant? So on and so forth. But the question I like to ask all guests when we just kick off each episode is, what is your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live? And we're recording this in early December of 2025.
Great. Yeah, so before I begin, I'll give the usual disclaimer I give on these things, which is that my views are my own and do not represent the views of my employer, any part of the US government, or any other entity with which I happen to be affiliated. To your question, when you first sent that to me via email, I was like, man, there are a lot of ways to answer that question.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was trying to think of a way to answer it that was not just completely pessimistic and negative, because I've been thinking about that a lot. It in some ways it's part of my day job as a war game analyst. You have to look at possible things that you may have to design games for, and they're usually unhappy things. But I'll say that, especially since the work I did on Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals, and thinking like more deeply on how Boyd viewed sort of strategy himself. I think the world and the people guiding some of the strategies today could use more Boyd. Um, and we can expand on what that means maybe later in the conversation. But one of the things that really sort of jumped out at me going in the process of doing the Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals, which is like full word, like everything Boyd said that's ever been recorded, like putting it down into writing. Um, he uh, he talks a lot about grand strategy and what it takes to succeed at like sort of the highest, national and global levels. Um, and he talks, and a lot of it is about basically like going out and making friends and finding allies and partners, and just like bringing more cooperative centers of gravity into your circle, so that to achieve your overall goal of surviving and thriving on your own terms, you have other centers of gravity there to help you. um and in looking around a world right now, I think there's a lot of fracturing in some of the networks that used to be cooperative centers of gravity for us. They're sort of fraying and becoming less cooperative. And on the flip side, I look at some of our adversaries and competitors, they're taking Boyd's advice and they're working together
Mm,
to enhance their own positions, to pursue their own goals. Um, and that's not going to be good for us.
mhm, mhm.
It's arguably not been good for us for a while, and it's not going to be good for us in the future. So I think we could use some more Boyd in our strategic thinking, kind of in the long term. I'll
Yeah.
leave it at
Oh,
that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we could go about this a couple of different ways. We could do like a like a linear march from Boyd in his formative years all the way through to his you know work in developing the OODA loop and so on and so forth. I'd like to maybe try to like maybe go to the end and then circle back to the beginning. And so I'm going to entitle this episode Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals after your book title. But that is a curious thing. Could you maybe give just like a short beat on what the snowmobiles concept is, and then let's go to the beginning, and then we'll work towards the snowmobiles concept from the beginning. Do you think you could do that?
Yeah, I think I will. I'll try at least.
Okay, yeah, yeah,
We'll see how successful I am. But
sure.
it's interesting. Like I was actually kind of struggling to figure out what the title for the second book was going to be, because given the volume of words that Boyd made in his presentation and the volume of slides, I was like, I mean, like, how do what common thread sort of ties these things together? Because if you've read or heard his presentations, like he sort of goes in some different directions. But in the process of doing the book, one thing actually that did jump out was he always came back to this analogy about how to build a snowmobile, right? And it finally clicked in my head that like this was his like little snapshot of how to look at the world, look at the pieces of information you had available to you, and how to assess and rearrange those pieces of information in new and different ways so that you could achieve your own goals and do something new that had not been done before. So this is an analogy he uses. It appears in different places in his presentations, but it's something that he always seemed to come back to. So, like I said, this is how you can look at the world to survive and thrive. So he walks his audience through a thought experiment, right? He says, first imagine um, you're skiing down a ski slope, or maybe you happen to live in summer climates. You're watching people water ski, right? So take the image of the skis and just kind of lock it away in your brain, right? All right, moving on. Think about people, riding motorcycle or riding bicycles, right? How do you steer a bicycle? You've got a set of handlebars that steers it, right?
Hmm.
So lock on to that image. Now slide forward and you're taking your kid to the store, right? And you see like there's a toy tank or a toy tractor that's got those caterpillar treads on it.
Hmm.
And take the image of those treads and um lock it away. All right. And then the last image is thinking about a uh, uh, vehicles that have outboard or exposed motors, like a motorcycle or a power boat or something like that.
Hmm.
Just like
Hmm.
take the motor and store that away. And then he goes back and he's like, all right, so we've got skis, we've got like bicycle handlebars, we've got tank treads, and we've got a outboard motor. What do those things seem to have to do with each other? And your first instinct might be, well, nothing. They're just like
Hmm.
different pieces of junk that don't do anything together. And he's like, no, you put those things together and you've got a snowmobile, right? You've got this weird conglomeration of bits and pieces that don't seem to fit together. But somebody looked at those and applied some new thinking and applied different lenses and perspectives that they built up throughout their own life. and they had the sort of the creativity to be like, what if these things could be put together to something useful?
Hmm.
And now you've got this, this vehicle that is absolutely useful and vital for, getting yourself through Arctic environments. And it was funny. I happened to be last Friday. I was at a symposium about maneuver warfare out in Washington State for some Washington State National Guard folks, and I was talking to one of the guardsmen, and he said, "Hey, like I was stationed in Alaska, right? I'm like, man, snowmobiles, that is how you get places."
Hmm.
In the guard up in Alaska, that's how you get places because you've got Humvees that are issued to you, but those things do not thrive in the
Mm.
Alaskan environment. It's snowmobiles, which is how you get there. And he thought that was he was asking why I picked that for my title, and I told him it's like, yeah, it's a useful thing that didn't exist, and somebody just looked at all these bits and pieces and was like, let's try something new to solve a problem. So
Yeah,
that's
that's
that's kind of
cool.
in a nutshell there's 700 pages to this book, right? Like that's in a nutshell the viewpoint he's trying to drive home in order to, survive and thrive. You have to be able to take bits of information, look at them in new ways to solve problems.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. Uh, but by the way, to our audience, I didn't mention this, but both of these books that Ian is mentioning, throughout the conversation, A New Conception of War and Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals, both of those are available through the Marine Corps University Press. There's links in the show notes. The PDFs are available for public consumption. So please check out both of these books to get a deeper dive into some of these items that Ian is bringing up here. When you were talking about the snowmobile analogy and building something new from seemingly disparate parts, I'll try to find this video, but when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone for the first time. I think it might have been 2006 or 2007, that time frame, as I recall, maybe 2008. But Steve Jobs was really famous for his flair and his presentation style at these Apple product launches. And he introduced the iPhone and goes through a elaborate presentation of the kinds of things that people are asking for these days. And so he was describing the iPhone as this thing where it's like a phone, but it's also a computing device and it's a music listening device or something like this. It's it sounded kind of similar to the whole snowmobile thing you were just going through. And then he puts up on the screen a picture of this you know phone that is like literally like a little miniature phone with like a rotary dial thing, and it's all kind of cobbled together, and everybody laughs, ha ha ha, very funny. But it turns out to be the iPhone, which is this really sleek designed device that was the early version of what we have today. But that's kind of like a snowmobile in the innovative, IT space. Would you say that that's a fair comparison?
Yeah, it is. And actually that you reminded me of a different visual image I had. Lord, what was it? I think it was a couple years ago. I took a couple of my kids to I think it was the Smithsonian Museum on American history, but they were having a special exhibit on the cell phone, and sort of how we got from the I'm going to date myself here, and maybe not all your list, maybe some of your listeners are too young to remember this, but I remember the first cell phone I saw was on the TV show Saved by the Bell, and Zach Morris had a cell phone, and that was the sign that he was from kind of this upper class, West Coast, cool California family. And it's this thing that's like bigger than a brick, right? Like
Yeah.
I remember he pulls it out of his jacket. I'm like, dude, you've been walking around with that all day. Like that's a lot of weight to put on yourself for for the sake of looking cool. But this exhibit sort of goes from like the very earliest versions of the cell phone. And then I remember there was like this one wall, it was like a flow chart of all of the different things that we have managed to cram into this one device.
Hmm.
And I'm showing my kids, and they're like, some of these devices like they've never seen before, right? Like the rotary phone you just mentioned, they've never seen a rotary phone in
Hmm.
real life. They've
Hmm.
seen it in movies, right? But like, things like telephone books full of phone numbers, you know, city maps and country maps for driving, a CD or a tape cassette player, a VHS movie video player, like, and this flowchart was like all these things are now inside of this one device because people just started getting, being like, well, what if, right? What if we could take a VHS player and put it in your hand so you can watch movies anywhere? Um, and it was just a really, as you said, a kind of interesting visualization of
Hmm. Hmm.
how technological, how innovation um, can occur. And yeah, again, like, nobody looked at a VHS player, 30 years ago and was like, wow, we could put this in somebody's hand someday, right?
Hmm.
Um, but
Hmm.
eventually somebody had that thought.
Right.
And that's sort of the same idea of like, how do I take a pair of skis and, put a motor on it,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, all right. Well, let's rewind and maybe go back to the beginning just a little bit. Could you give just like a short little like intro bio sketch of who Colonel John Boyd was, back in his formative years and early days in the military?
Yeah, I will do my best to keep this succinct. So he he was born during the Great Depression. If anybody who's read my book, New Conception of War, if you read the first, what is it? No, first or second chapter, I kind of get into Boyd's life. I think the Great Depression was a very formative experience for him, as it was for many people of his generation. But I think for him, the experience was sort of like cranked up to a higher level, right? And I think he sort of took two things away from growing up in the Great Depression. One was he learned at a pretty early age a very strong independent streak because his father passed away when he was at a pretty young age. Um, and and he had siblings, and so his mother had a lot of stuff to take care of, right? Like, breadwinner in addition to raising a family, she couldn't be everywhere all the time at once. So like he sort of developed an independent streak of going and doing stuff on his own. Um, but separately, that independent streak, I feel, and I think the evidence of his life bears it out, that he also developed a very keen sense of, if you give me this, like, give me room to maneuver, give me my freedom and independence, but I will pay you back with something concrete, something valuable, um, to help you out. So like, so that could be anything from, hey, working some jobs while his mother was trying to raise the kids, right? Mom may not know where he's at, but he's coming home and he's helping support the family because he's working these jobs. So I think those two threads are things he sort of carried through with him his entire life,
Hmm.
and it started there. So, but child of the Great Depression, um, he was he was too young to really get into action in World War II. He did join the Army Air Corps at the very end of the war. But he never got he didn't see any combat. He was sent overseas to Japan sort of during the post-war occupation period for a couple years where he did lots of swimming and sports and stuff. Um, and then he went to school, but he did Air Force ROTC during school, um, and got trained up as an F-35 pilot because he sort of had the sense like, hey, World War II is over, but I'm looking at the strategic landscape, that, as we started our conversation, as the Cold War is sort of starting to solidify and sides are forming, he was like, there's probably going to be another war. And so he kind of wanted to contribute. He missed out World War II. He wanted to contribute, so he does Air Force ROTC. He gets commissioned. Korean War kicks off, and so he gets activated. Has to go through additional training as a. Did I say F-35? I'm sorry, F-86 pilot, not an
Okay.
F-35 pilot.
No,
Um,
he wasn't wasn't quite there yet. No.
that was yeah,
Yeah.
I wasn't quite there yet. My bad. But so trained as
That's
an
right.
F-86 Sabre pilot, and he did get over to Korea, sort of again toward the tail end of the war. He if anyone who's worked in military aviation knows there's like flight leadership qualifications and stuff that you get as you progress through your career. He didn't get it. He didn't get into theater in time to sort of start working through those qualifications, but he did fly in combat. And in fact, in his oral histories of his time, there's some very interesting stories of him and his wingmen sometimes booming across the Yalu River, going to look for enemy MiGs. And there was one story actually where they're not supposed to do this, by the way. They're not supposed to cross the Yalu, but
Hmm.
they wanted to go hunting. So one time he crossed the Yalu and he found the enemy, right? But then all his guns jammed and his radio broke.
Wow.
So he wound up in this like completely defensive furball with him and his other wingman, and they're just trying to get the hell out of there, alive. Um, but after the war, he was a good enough pilot that he was asked to teach at the Air Force's fighter weapons school, and that's kind of where he started like being unsatisfied with how the world was being presented to his students, and so he wanted to start sort of building new frameworks or perspectives to better analyze problems and find solutions. So
Was this in
he
Alabama? Is that where that's at?
no, this was in Nellis Air Force Base.
Ah, okay. All right.
I think he'll get down to the South later in his life.
Oh, is that right?
Um,
Somewhere in Alabama at the what is it? It's the Air Force University.
yeah, Air
Uh,
University's down there in Alabama.
The Air University. They have one of the roads is the Oodle Loop Road down there.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, it's one of the very few sort of testimonials the Air Force has ever given Boyd.
Is that right?
Um,
Do you think you could talk about that for just a moment? His relationship with the Air Force uh, and then ultimately with the Marine Corps as well?
yeah, so it's
Are there any
I,
analogies with, or I believe I've heard analogies between John Boyd and Billy Mitchell, like they're brothers in the sense that their outlook or their philosophy or their perspectives on the unfolding nature of conflict and how to engage appropriately were not appreciated in their time. Would you say that that's right?
Um, well, it's interesting. I think it's kind of yes and no because um, depending on the branch of service,
Hmm.
Boyd's ideas were appreciated in their time, just not necessarily by his parents' service. So I
Hmm.
think his relationship with the Air Force might best be characterized as they were frenemies. His did he have like real positive contributions to Air Force capabilities from the Cold War, arguably through today? And I think the answer is unquestionably yes, right? Like he
This
was
is
put onto the F-15.
part of his what is it information maneuver entropy maneuver what is
Oh no, the
EM
energy
energy
maneuverability.
maneuver, yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of like his concrete contributions to the Air Force and the U.S. military writ large, he came in and made some changes to the F-15 procurement program that arguably made it a better jet. He was the brains behind the F-16 fighter jet. And you look at the Air Force today, right? F-15, F-16 still in service, and they are sufficiently good airframes that like yeah, I know the Air Force, but they got F-22s and they got F-35s, but the F-15 and the F-16 are still like the workhorse of
Mm.
of Air Force, like tactical aviation. And the fact that those airframes are so capable and that they are they're not just capable in their own right, but they were built with a sufficiently good sort of architecture that you can keep adding stuff to them, and they're still useful in your inventory. The Air Force is those two planes are still that is Boyd influencing the Air Force today. The energy maneuverability theory that you just mentioned, that was part of his work. He was not in Alabama, but he was in Florida, if I remember correctly, um, doing as one does, calculus and physics in his spare time as a hobby. But the point of it was he was trying to find a way to um, objectively quantify aircraft performance because up until that point, and something he'd observed in Korea, right, was like the F-86, um, in a lot of ways was not as good an aircraft as the MiGs that they were flying against, but it had a better kill ratio and it seemed to be doing better. And he was trying to he was trying to
Mm.
figure out why, like why was that the case? Because the MiGs were bigger, they were faster in terms of absolute airspeed, they could carry heavy armament, but why was the F-86 a better aircraft?
Hmm.
So he grappled with this for several years until he came up with the energy maneuverability equation, which is basically like if you if you take an aircraft's core performance characteristics, let me see if I remember these, of like
Lift,
thrust,
lift, drag,
yeah,
thrust. Yeah.
lift, drag, thrust,
Gravity,
weight. Yeah,
weight.
gravity. Yeah, weight,
Okay.
gravity. If you if you take those aircraft attributes, you can plug them in and you can actually build like a performance chart for where that aircraft is going to have a lot of potential energy that can be turned into kinetic energy in terms of maneuverability, right?
Hmm.
And if you do that for lots of aircraft, like an enemy aircraft, you can overlay those charts on top of each other and see objectively, mathematically, what envelopes your aircraft are going to be, better, more agile performers in, and where your adversary's aircraft are going to be better, more performant agiles. And knowing that, you want those windows where you're better, and you want to avoid those windows where your adversary is better. And you can also flip that around and like, hey, if you want to design an aircraft that has particular performance characteristics, now you can calculate it, right? You can do the math on, oh, okay, I want a really awesome thrust to weight ratio. Now I've got an equation that'll help me work that out. And you want to talk about an impact across the United States military. I remember when I was still flying, even the fat, slow, unmaneuverable CH-53 has energy maneuverability charts that are developed to it,
Mm.
to pair its performance against other adversary aircraft. Because, as it turns out, there are some windows where your 53 has some advantages over, say, a fighter jet, right? And which seems counterintuitive, but it turns out when you're going really, really slow, your ability to maneuver and turn inside of a certain turn radius is actually
Mm.
better than a jet that's booming along, right? Like 900 knots. Um, you can turn and get away from them, and go down and hide in the train. By the time they've like zoomed out 10 miles and now they're coming back from their turn, you're gone. You've gone down
Hmm.
because you
Hmm.
have an advantage in terms of maneuverability at that slower airspeed. So every U.S. military aircraft is the beneficiary of Boyd's energy maneuverability theory. Whether the
Mm.
pilots know where those charts came from or not, every platform has got those charts to help determine aircraft performance.
Right. So
Um,
you amended my mention about Boyd and his relationship with the Air
yeah,
Force.
well,
He did make contributions. He was appreciated by the Air Force, but some of his work
well,
that
so
that ultimately became the OODA loop was not initially appreciated, perhaps.
his I think his legacy, and I'm not dinging, our
Yeah,
fellow
yeah,
brothers and sisters in the Air Force, but like,
sure.
but at the time, so Boyd he had these concrete contributions, right? But the way he had a personality in the same way that Billy Mitchell had a personality. In that he didn't really suffer fools lightly, and he had zero problem telling more senior people when he thought they were stupid or jacked up. And the development stories of both of those aircraft, F-15, F-16, um, follow that time frame where people were critiquing what he was doing in terms of aircraft design, and he would tell people in uncertain terms, like, no, like the F-15, for example, the initial prototype and how it was comparing to the Navy prototypes at the time. He told them it was garbage. You guys are building a gold-plated toilet that is going to be over budget, and it's going to underperform. I'm going to make you something better. And he told people that, poking them in the chest. They didn't really like that, right?
Hmm.
Um, and he spent some time in the Pentagon, um, again, sort of looking over procurement stuff. And he would tell people, generals and senior leaders to their faces when he thought they were wrong, stupid, and short-sighted. And that doesn't make you a lot of friends,
Hmm.
especially if you're looking for a longer term career. So he, so at the time, he retired as a colonel in the Air Force, which I think retiring as a colonel is still a good thing, right? You still made it a lot farther than a lot of other people. Um,
I would
but
say
there's,
so. Yeah.
yeah, I would say so. But there's some of his biographers have thought, if he could have gone a lot farther. Thing is, he pissed a lot of people off in the way he had limited patience for people who were not open, who were not receptive and open, to some of those, to new ideas, to thinking in different ways. Um, on the and so that sort of culminated his career in the Air Force, but he wasn't done producing things. And so this takes us into his ideas on conflict, and the various lectures and briefings that he gave, and his work on what would sort of culminate in the OODA loop. Those presentations he gave to sort of almost any audience that would listen. He gave it to the Army. He gave it to, I think he gave it to, people in the Pentagon, but he also gave it a lot to the Marine Corps. And that resonated deeply with the Marine Corps at the time. And so as you look at, I tell a story in New Conception of War of how these threads weave together, but, you know, maybe Boyd, sort of left the Air Force unappreciated in his own time, even though they're still flying his planes today, right? All he gets out of the Air Force is the OODA loop at Air University. Whereas, in the late 70s, 80s, at the time, the Marine Corps was all about listening to his ideas and thinking about how to incorporate them. Um, and that continued really through the time of Boyd's death in 1997. The Marine Corps was all about it, right? And adopted it into the Marine Corps' capstone warfighting concept of maneuver warfare. And that's why there's a reason that the professional papers of Boyd, who was an Air Force colonel, his papers reside in the United States Marine Corps History Division archives, because at the end of his life, the Marine Corps was deeply cognizant and grateful for his ideas, and they wanted to be the ones to preserve his legacy, for future beneficiaries. And his family, his estate, was all about it. They wanted the papers to go to the Marine Corps because the Marine Corps knew what it got from Boyd, and they were grateful at the time they got it.
Yeah. Could you tell our audience a little bit more about those archives in Quantico? I mean, anybody can go and check them out, can they not?
Yes, I mean, you need base access, right?
Hmm.
But that's just something you got to work through with, the base security. But no, the Marine Corps archives are great. They're open they're open to anybody. If you can get onto base, you can enter the archives. And then even if you cannot get on base, they're very good and responsive digitally in working through stuff. And in fact, during COVID, I was asking them to pull and scan stuff out of some of the Boyd collection so I could continue work on the book. And they were helpful and responsive, and like, they know their collections like the back of their hands. So if you're like, I'm trying to find this paper from, I read about it somewhere or I heard about it in a recorded interview, but I don't know where in the collection it might be. They're like, I got you. Give us a few days. Let's see what we can work out. So, I think the Marine Corps archives are fantastic. They punch above their weight in terms of their staffing, and they're deeply knowledgeable and helpful. And they were a tremendous asset in I could not have done any of this work without the help that they gave me.
Yeah, yeah. So, you and I, we were, born and raised with Boyd and hearing about the OODA loop, or at least I was from, day one in the Marines. I remember getting instruction on the OODA loop, which is Boyd's work, the observe, orient, decide, and act loop. Um, I always, thought about this in the most literal and concrete, linear, I would say, terms. Linear, even though it's a loop, right? Is what we were all taught was get inside the enemy's OODA loop. Perform these four tasks faster than your adversary, and ultimately you're going to wind up outpacing your adversary, which is what you want. That's the 101 version of the OODA loop, which makes intuitive sense. And putting it into a really simple framework really helps communicate all that. But um, I mean, frankly, since I retired from the Marines, I did not appreciate the deeper implications of the OODA loop. And this gets towards back up to the top. Your mentions about center of gravity and grand strategy and so on and so forth. But do you think you could like introduce our audience to some of the more profound implications that are contained within the OODA loop?
Sure. So uh, I'll start by saying my first um, awareness of the OODA loop is kind of similar to yours, right? Like
Hmm.
in entry level training in the Marine Corps, they hand you MCDP one, which has a footnote that talks about the OODA loop. And but I don't know your sort of the rest of your experience, but I recall like after that initial entry level training, I didn't hear about the OODA loop again until I started doing flight training. And
Mm-hmm.
then once we got into some of the more advanced tactical training events, the instructors would talk about, the OODA loop in the cockpit as your decision making cycle, where in, fast paced tactical aviation environment, you want your OODA loop to be faster than the guy you're flying against, right? So that you
Hmm.
can
Hmm.
survive. Um, but I never at any other point sort of got any expansion on that in the Marine Corps or explanation of it. Um,
Nor
but
did
in
I.
doing,
Nor did I.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
which in that was part of my motivation, among many motivations for writing the first book, New Conception of War, was to like explain why the OODA loop and like Boyd mattered to a new generation of Marines,
Hmm.
because a lot of the the context that was going on in like the 70s and 80s and 90s, that was just like, it was part of the stew that you were in, and like it didn't need to be written down because people were talking about it, right?
Mm.
Everybody understood the context. Well, I came to the Marine Corps well after that period, and that context was gone, right? So like it was unclear to me like why maneuver warfare was so important, why warfighting was such a groundbreaking publication, and why I should care about the OODA loop. Nobody ever told me because that context had been lost. So I wanted to try and kind of recapture that. But but why does it matter as a framework? What's interesting was the more research I did, the sort of clearer it became that like Boyd did not start with the OODA loop and then sort of try and reverse engineer the rest of his thought to
Mm.
fit into it. Interestingly, like he didn't actually sketch out the loop itself until a couple of years before he died. Because partly one, because he was afraid it might be misused and misinterpreted. And
Yeah.
yeah, you've probably seen cases, and as I did my own research, um, that's kind of what happens. Like it often got turned into an oversimplified linear process, which was not at all what he was trying to
Hmm.
capture, which is
Hmm.
partly why he didn't put it in writing until the end, because it got misinterpreted, just like he thought. Um, but also interestingly, the OODA loop is sort of a capstone encapsulation of the decades of thinking about conflict and competition and survival that he had
Mm,
done before that. And the loop was sort of like the a final um lid or roof or cover
hmm
to all of that thinking. Um and that's why in the Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals, the very last chapter we talked about, and I put this as purpose in the last chapter, talk about like how sort of Boyd himself saw the OODA loop, and we include some photographs of sketches from the archives that he made where he takes the pieces of the loop, but then he's got a little key and he's explaining like um how the what the different pieces of the loop mean to him and how they were expressed in his different presentations. So he talks about like sort of the utility of the loop as something that's key to the patterns of conflict briefing. But then the things that are inside the orientation step of the OODA loop, like he talks
hmm
about your genetic heritage, new information, your cultural tradition, previous
Culture. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I got it pulled up, just to our audience. If you go to page 616, I think this is the diagram Ian's talking about, but has a lot of arrows and feedback, but it's that orient portion of the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, then act, which has such a, I don't know, there's more to the orient portion of this diagram than to any of the other. Why do you think so much is
It's,
dedicated to the orient portion of the Udalupian?
so the pieces of little P, those trace back to different themes that he talks about in his different presentations. Um, but the interrelation of those aspects in orientation, to include the analysis and synthesis piece, which ties directly back to his essay "Destruction and Creation." Which,
Yeah, yeah,
if orientation is the engine of the OODA loop, destruction and creation is the engine of all of Boyd's thought. Subsequently,
right.
it
You
was
can
one of the
also get a whiff of the snowmobiles there, right? The destruction and the creation. The creation would be the snowmobile.
Yeah, the destruction is taking the bicycle handles off the bicycle and the skis off the water skier and the
Yeah,
treads off the tank tread. That's the destruction aspect. And then the creation is, well, I put these things together and what do I have? I have something new that helps me survive on my own terms, which is the core point of destruction and creation. And that surviving and thriving on your own terms is the engine, is the through line that goes through everything else he talks about for the rest of his life. Goes back to that. And orientation is the is his sort of codification of the different aspects that allow you to build that perspective to thrive and make decisions under your own terms, um, by having all of these different lenses and perspectives to look at the world around you, to assess it, to break it down into different pieces and to reassemble it into new pieces that are new to you. That's the orientation process. And something I've usually tried to drive home to when I've talked about this stuff is like this is the shortfall I think in like how the Marine Corps explained it, because like again, if your experience was like mine, first time I heard about the OODA loop, you're like, all right, I'm going to observe, which means I'm looking at what's going on around me, right?
yeah,
Then I'm
yeah,
going to
yeah, yeah.
orient. I'm going to orient, and orient was always like, I'm going to think about the things I've seen,
Yes,
and that's
yes.
about it. And then you move on, well, and like, well, I've thought about it. Now I'm going to go on and decide, and then I'm going to act. And the idea is like you work through that as fast as you can, and somehow you gain advantage from that. But the orientation piece was always something that was sort of described or sold as like it's only happening in the moment, right? Like after you observe what's going on in the moment. And Boyd's point is all of the different elements of orientation, the genetic heritage, culture, tradition, previous experiences, the analysis and synthesis, those are things that you need to build long before the moment of crisis comes. Because if you have not built yourself a repository of of information and patterns and experience that you can draw from prior to the fight, man, you're not going to magically pull it out of your rear end when the fight happens, right? Like if the first time I orient against an enemy is in the moment, I'm going to die or I'm going to fail or other people are going to fail. Whereas if then that's whereas you if you consciously work on having all of those bubbles inside orientation be bigger and fuller of more information, when the time to orient comes in the moment, you're potentially drawing on not just your own experiences, your own habit patterns of analysis and synthesis and looking at problems and trying to solve them. um, you bring all of that with you, and you can control that. Which is another one of his points is you control your own orientation inside the OODA loop, which means your orientation begins the day you're born. And all of your
Mm-hmm.
life is spent filling up those bubbles in different ways, so that when moments come when you have to make a decision for your own survival, your orientation and all of its subcomponents are as robust, as full, as rich as possible. So you have a massive repository of knowledge and patterns and experience that you can draw from to help solve your problem and solve it creatively, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
like build a snowmobile to solve your problems, essentially.
Yeah.
That's what orientation does. And if you're aware of how you can control it, you can build your orientation to be bigger, more robust, richer, and deeper than your competitors and your adversaries. Um, and you should do so if you need to build that if you want to survive and thrive on your own terms.
Hmm. Um, uh, it's also a framework for decision making amidst uncertainty. You mentioned the destruction and creation article. We'll have a link to that in the show notes for people to check out as well. That was what, 1976 time?
1976, yes, I think you're right.
Yeah, it was never like officially published, right? It's just what has been PDF'd and is available. Is that about right?
Yeah, yeah. It was never, to my knowledge, it was never like published in an
Yeah,
academic or scientific journal.
yeah, yeah.
But the PDF is I mean, he shared it with friends and interested people.
Hmm.
I'd also note that it is included in Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals as one of the chapters. So
Okay, great. Yeah,
and we did that because that is the engine that drives all the other presentations. So we wanted to make sure that we started with the engine, because you can't understand the rest of his presentations without reading Destruction and Creation.
right. And I mean, he gets pretty deep into some heady topics and philosophy in that piece. So people could check it out. But we're talking like quantum theory, or at least like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. In Heisenberg, had a lot of was an early quantum pioneer. But also Gödel's incompleteness theorem. But the bottom line is that, I mean, this applies to life and to business and to national security, but dealing with uncertainty, or accepting uncertainty, and knowing that whatever it is that you're engaging with, you're not going to have the complete picture ever. The OODA loop, helps guide people, or guide decision makers through that uncertainty, and reorienting again and again and again, because whatever you're dealing with at this very moment has never, ever existed before. And so that is why the OODA loop is so critical to be, reevaluating what's happening right now, because it is literally, brand new in the history of time.
Yeah, and his point about uncertainty is, you're dead on, right? Like you will never remove uncertainty, and kind of the point he makes in Destruction and Creation is you you will probably never have like a completely perfect view of the world environment around you, that is 100% accurate. but you want to get as accurate and as complete a view as possible. And that means understanding that the world is always changing around you, which means you need to be constantly changing, updating, adapting your own perspectives so that, well, you may never achieve, 100% perfect perspective on what the world is actually like. Maybe you get to 85 or 90% because you are constantly updating and evaluating and assessing to pull in new information to better understand it. Um, and to as you just as you said, like to help deal with that uncertainty, like no two situations are alike. But that's why you want to build up your orientation to be as robust and rich as possible, because the no, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so if you build up your orientation with lots of, personal knowledge you've derived from other people, by reading, playing war games, if you're in the military, like, going out and doing field exercises, um, learning from experiences of others, like opening your aperture to, he talks about cultural traditions. Boy, we could go in all kinds of different directions, but from a military perspective, right? US, like we have our own, cultural traditions and background. Well, we went to Iraq and Afghanistan, very different cultures, very different traditions. We can't just like assume that we can operate effectively over there and not look at those cultures and traditions to try and understand what's going on beneath the surface, right? What they value, what they don't like, and importing that knowledge to ourselves so that it builds out our repertoire of possible options for dealing with that problem. And his whole point is like, you may never, no two situations are the same, and you may never have the perfect perspective of the world. But
Mm-hmm.
if you have a huge repository of this knowledge and information and patterns and understanding that you've derived from other things, when a moment comes, it may not look exactly like something you've experienced before, but
Mm-hmm.
you have enough bits and pieces from different experiences and different perspectives that may either match or echo the circumstance, or could be disassembled and
Mm-hmm.
reassembled into something that is useful to you in that circumstance. That is how you move in through making decisions that are uh, help your own survival, and then taking actions that help your own survival, because you've built up that repository to draw from, right? To draw from and have bits and pieces that you can apply to the situation in front of you. And the more bits and pieces you've incorporated into your orientation, um, it's a deeper reservoir that you have to solve your problem and think of ways of solving that problem creatively, rather than having a tiny little soda straw aperture where you're discombobulated or disrupted or paralyzed because something new happens to you and you have no idea what to do about it, because you've done nothing in your past life, past experience, to give you options by building out your orientation to give you some choices to draw from in the moment.
Yeah. All right. Snowmobiles and Grand Ideals, and A New Conception of War, two books by Ian Brown, with the New Conception of War, 6 or 7 years running on the Commandant's reading list. So, link in the show notes to both of those, plus other items mentioned during the discussion. And with that, Ian Brown, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Great. Like I said, thank you for the opportunity. I think you can tell I love talking about this stuff, so I'm grateful for the chance to talk about it a little bit more.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.